Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with the Rational Independent. I hope you enjoyed your 4th of July weekend. We are getting back into it. And as we head into the 2024 primary season and start to look at the 2024 election cycle, we're seeing some moves, some policy moves, and some strategic positioning. And as Democrat and Republican parties start to jockey for position. We have an article from The Hill today on abortion in light of that election. So, headline, Senate Republicans fear abortion could derail hopes for a majority. Fair, pretty straightforward, and honestly, not a terrible headline. Some headlines that we have that we find are exercises in duplicity. This one's pretty straightforward. So let's dive into it, kind of unpack this issue a little bit. So the reporter got an anonymous source of a Republican strategist who requested anonymity in order to discuss strategy. That's fine. Any state where Republicans have trouble with suburban voters because of the Trump brand, they had double trouble with suburban voters because of abortion politics, speaking of the 22 midterm. And it was for no reason, because there's no chance of a federal ban on abortion. There's no chance a federal ban on abortion happens ever. We're talking about the 22 election. For those of you who are not super nerds about politics, the first term of a president during the midterm election, that president's party, historically, almost always loses seats in both the House and the Senate. This happens like clockwork. It's actually very, very rare circumstances that this doesn't happen. If you think about in the 90s, 1992, President Clinton gets elected. 94, you get the huge swing where Republicans take the majority of the House for the first time in like 40-something years. You have Newt Gingrich's Contract for America, and you start to see some serious Republican power plays in 90s politics from the House of Representatives. That was the midterm following President Clinton's election. This happens pretty consistently. Now, here's what's interesting. One of the only exceptions to that rule was 2002, the midterm election for George W. Bush, in which the Republican Party gained power. However, basically that was a wartime footing situation. If you think about it, this is a year after September 11th. That changes things. If there's a war on, kind of all bets are off. Particularly if you have a very popular president and a very popular war, as opposed to like Vietnam, unpopular president, unpopular war. It's another story. One of the other interesting exceptions was President Obama's first term. He was elected in 2008. In 2010, you had the Tea Party sweep in, and you had a huge swing towards the Republicans in the legislative houses. When President Obama was elected, he actually had a supermajority in the Senate and a strong majority in the House. In other words, he controlled all three, both houses, and the Democrats controlled all three houses and the presidency. In other words, at the start of President Obama's term, he controlled the presidency and the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, with a supermajority in the Senate, a filibuster-proof majority, which meant that essentially they could do whatever they wanted. And what they chose to do was push through Obamacare. As a reaction to that, in 2010, the next chance the voters got a chance to act, they walloped President Obama, and the Tea Party came in and presented kind of a thorn in his side. And honestly, if you look at President Obama's legislative accomplishments, they're pretty much all in his first 2 years. Not much else really effectively happened. He's famous for saying, I have a pen and a phone. He did a lot of things through executive action. He did a lot of things through media messaging, etc. Stuff still happened. But legislatively, the Democrats got very little done for the remainder of President Obama's 2 terms. Now, we have President Biden. He's not a popular president. The economy's not doing well. It's not a wartime footing. There's no reason why his party shouldn't lose power. In addition, they were holding on to a majority in the Senate by the barest of threads. 50-50 split. But the vice president breaks the tie, and the vice president is Kamala Harris, so she breaks the tie. So technically the Democrats have the slimmest of majorities in the Senate, and only something like, I think, 15 seats in the House. So coming into the 2022 election, the Republicans barely squeezed out a majority in the House and failed to take control of the Senate during an election that they should have had a strong advantage on. Now, there's more details to it. We can get super nerdy if you want, talk about vulnerable seats because only a third of the Senate comes up every 2 years, and there are layers to this. But broadly speaking, it was a major disappointment for the Republicans to not make any headway in 2022. And one of the reasons why is what the strategist said. Voters in college-educated suburban white women hate Donald Trump with passion. And they're not terribly big fans of the Republican Party either. You have, demographically, when pollsters and analysts look at the results of the 22 election, that was a demographic where the Republicans did very poorly. So like he says here, in districts where the Republicans were having trouble with suburban voters, they identify part of the issue was President Trump was still tied to the Republican Party. Even though he wasn't the elected president, the Democratic Party was able to effectively run against Trump in the midterm, even though he wasn't on the ticket. And that worked for them, for better or for worse. But also because of abortion politics. And this is what's, in our conclusion, we'll get back to this, but this is the challenge of emotionally driven politics. And we'll get to that. One of the reasons why this is a tricky spot for the Republican Party to be in is because there are Republicans like Lindsey Graham that are pushing for a one-size-fits-all policy on abortion, that they are actually looking to put forth a federal ban on abortion. So as from the article, some Republicans argue that pushing GOP lawmakers to embrace a national ban is a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't give Republican candidates enough space to advocate for their own deeply held convictions. It takes time to build political consensus. It takes a certain amount of energy, and it takes kind of a historical set of pressures to push people into agreement. There's a parallel here to the abortion debate, between the abortion debate and the slavery debate several hundred years ago, in the sense that the Republican Party was founded at its inception to fight against slavery. Prior to that, the former party that a lot of people switched to Republican, I think it was Whig, was pretty weak sauce on slavery. And as the consensus was building on the right to move against slavery, the Republican Party was born out of those political pressures that united people on that single issue. This must end. This must be something we all come together and we pay the price necessary in order to stamp this out. There are people in the Republican Party and elsewhere who are making the argument that the Republican Party needs to do the same thing with abortion. They need to say, this must end. This is like slavery. We need to ban it. We need to squash it. We need to get rid of it. As someone who is morally opposed to abortion, I appreciate that sentiment. I do. However, if the consensus isn't there yet, you can shoot yourself in the foot advocating for and pushing too aggressively for people to act like there is a consensus there. It is rare that there's a policy that fits at a federal level, that one size truly can fit all across the board. And that's one of the reasons why I prefer state legislation to federal legislation, because federal legislation too often paints with too broad of a brush. And that's the challenge I think that we have here. I don't think in a weak Republican Party with a fractured caucus, I don't think we have the kind of majority necessary to accomplish this legitimate and good legislative end. And I think putting that legislative purpose out there before you gain the power is actually going to backfire on the Republicans. And that leads to my last quote. The Democrats would love nothing more than congressional Republicans to raise the discussion of abortion instead of inflation, crime, or other issues that Democrats are weak on going into a presidential election. That's from a GOP strategist. There's two things Democrats need: Donald Trump and the abortion issue. And that's really the crux of what we're talking about here. The Republican Party, as we've discussed before, is a party that I believe is designed to get rich while losing slowly. I can see that establishment Republicans would find it appealing to do some moral grandstanding to win some points for their base while accomplishing their own political objective, which is to stay in the minority and let the Democrats take the blame for things while chivying their base and saying, look at this moral travesty, now give me money. That is a cynical move. We live in cynical times. I don't trust Lindsey Graham, and he seems to be the one that's pushing this ban. And I don't trust him to not be doing something that is that cynically manipulative of the American people. So I'm leery of this initiative. Coming back to it, I also want to point out that for myself, you can't fix this from a federal issue. And here's why. This is not the same as slavery. It is a moral wrong. It is a moral evil. That's true. And it is something that must be stopped. That's also true. But at the end of the day, the need for abortion arises not from the slave trade, not from overt acts out in society in which society has a role to play. At the end of the day, the simple truth is this. Abortion arises because we live in a country where chastity and fidelity to your spouse is no longer a priority. Yes, there are some instances of rape and incest, and we can deal with that as a one-off situation. But the reality is that most abortions are essentially utilized as backup birth control. That's why most of them are early on in the pregnancy process. That's why most of them are not terribly well thought out. That's why most of them impact women who do not have strong economic foundations. They are very rarely triggered by medical necessity. The medical institution is amazing at protecting the life of the unborn when that's the choice of the parents. And it's equally good at destroying that life. So it is almost never driven by medical necessity. Again, it does happen, but it's by far the exception. But if I'm a Democratic strategist and I don't want to run on Biden because he's a lunatic and he's got dementia, and I don't want to run on Biden's corruption because his family is crazy corrupt. Look at Hunter, look at money transfers from the Chinese Communist Party to his family members. Not just Hunter, not just Joe. There are confirmed wire transfers to sisters and brothers and nieces and whatever, because the goal was to get the money to the family in whatever way they could. That's not supposition at this point. There's hard evidence that these transfers occurred. Let them explain where the money came from and why. So the Democrats don't want to talk about that. If you let your enemy pick your battleground, you're almost always going to lose. And the Republican Party is shaping up to make 2024 about Donald Trump and about abortion. And those are two issues that are easy to lose on. Can you pull out a victory? Sure. Crazy things happen. Long odds come through every once in a while. But when you have sound financial, economic data that shows that this administration has been a catastrophe, why not run on that? If you have the crushing weight of debt, why not run on that? If you have rampant spending and political corruption at the highest levels, why not run on that? Because those are paths that are much more likely to lead to victory. But the Republicans don't seem to want to choose that. And I believe it's because they want to lose close losses. They want to lose slowly. They want to retain credibility. But they want to lose slowly and get rich in the process. That's my rant for today. Good luck out there.